Hello, welcome to Least Political. It's me, your host, Annie Murray. Here at Least Political, we don't have time for talking about serious issues that our country is facing. Nope. Here it's all about the chicanery of our political leaders and newsmakers. uh, anyway, I'd like to talk about that exclusive interview with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution by Dino journalists Tamar Hellerman and Bill Rankin. These guys did a fantastic job. In the interview, which lasted about 2 hours, 5 of the 23 special grand jurors recounted what it was like to be a pivotal, albeit anonymous, part of one of the most momentous criminal investigations in U.S. history, one of which could lead to the indictment or another indictment of former President Donald Trump and his allies. It's obvious these guys took their work on the grand jury incredibly seriously. One juror is quoted as saying, quote, "One of the most important things will be a part of our lives was the 8-month process that we did," adding, "It was incredibly important to get it right." These guys sometimes met 3 times a week for 8 months. The AJC writes, they had described a process that was in turn fascinating, tedious, and emotionally wrenching. One juror said she would cry in her car at the end of the day after hearing from witnesses whose lives had been upended by disinformation and claims of election fraud. I completely get that. I know not everyone watched the January 6 hearings, but we had some witnesses testify about what became of their lives when they were targeted by Donald Trump as bad people who changed ballots in the 2020 election. Specifically, I'm talking about Shaye Moss and her mom, Ruby Freeman. Didn't she say her name was Lady Ruby? These women cried in the hearing because what happened to them was so extreme. The death threats, the hate, having to vacate their homes and live elsewhere for months and months. It was just a shame that this can and did happen to America with 2 election workers doing their civil duty. Heck, I've never done anything like that. I mean, we need someone to do it, and good for Shaye Moss and Ruby Freeman. For 8 months, the special grand jury jurors were unable to talk to their loved ones, coworkers, or anyone about what they were doing and hearing. They said the overall panel was diverse with different races, economic backgrounds, and political viewpoints represented. That sounds really interesting. So the left and the right, I'd like to be a fly on that wall. The Fulton County Grand Jury was officially dissolved in January after submitting its final report. The jurors who spoke to the AJC declined to talk about portions of their final report that remains under seal, including who they recommended Fulton County DA Fani Willis indict. In Georgia, they're legally allowed to say, those grand jurors are legally allowed to say anything to anyone after the special grand jury has dissolved, apart from their internal deliberations. In recent interviews, jury foreperson Emily Kors said that with those suggested indictments, quote, "It's not a short list," end quote, interestingly enough. Emily Kors was not among those 5 anonymous jurors interviewed for this article. The AJC does write that those jurors understood the gravity of their assignment and took care to be active participants in as many sessions as possible. They said the investigation was somber and thorough. I guess it would be pretty somber. As I mentioned, these guys are legally allowed to divulge details except for internal deliberations. Some of these court words, they're a little difficult. Juror, juror. No one's going to see this. One of the jurors said that they had heard a recording of a phone call from Trump to the late Georgia head speaker of the House, David Ralston, in which the president asked the fellow Republican to convene with a special session of the legislature to overturn Democrat Joe Biden's narrow victory in Georgia. One juror added that Ralston proved to be, quote, an amazing politician, end quote, that the speaker, quote, basically cut the president off. He says, I will do anything in my power that I think is appropriate. He basically just took the wind out of the sails, end quote, adding, quote, well, thank you, is all the president could say, end quote. FYI, Ralston did not call a special session, nor did any of the other legislative leaders. One of the jurors described how within their 75 witnesses they heard from or told about fell into 3 buckets. The first bucket said who were interviewed, it happened early on and were generally forthcoming. The second were witnesses who needed to receive a subpoena but were generally willing to talk. The third bucket were people who clearly did not want to be here and tried to fight their summons. These people tended to be people who had been or still were close to Donald Trump. One juror saying, quote, it was like night and day when the second group finished and we got the third. The tone in the room completely changed like overnight, end quote. Generally, the prosecutors handling the special grand jury would take the lead in questioning the witnesses. However, jurors were able to ask their own questions, follow-up questions. They said prosecutors took pains not to give their personal opinions, but only offer guidance as to what is legal under the law. Interestingly enough, I like to say that, several jurors said that prosecutors never hinted about who might be charged during any of those 8 months. This was not easy for these jurors. One saying, quote, I was pretty emotional throughout the whole thing. I wouldn't cry in front of any of the witnesses, but when I would get in my car, I was just like, I just left that and I have to go to my job and now I just know things that are hard to know. I believe them. One juror recalled how South Carolina's Senator Lindsey Graham spoke about Trump's state of mind in the months following the 2020 election. Quote, he said that during that time, if someone had told Trump that aliens came down and stole Trump's ballots, that Trump would have believed it. End quote. Aliens. But it does speak to how unstable he was. He's just well, I don't want to say it, but you guys, you know. 2 of the jurors estimated that about 10 witnesses invoked their Fifth Amendment rights. Oddly enough, some doing so even when asked about factual things like their education, maybe their middle name, I don't know. In a prior interview, Emily Corr said witnesses like White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and Rudy Giuliani refused to answer some, if not most, of the prosecutor's questions. There's been speculation that perhaps Mark Meadows received a pardon before he left the White House. If that were true, he wouldn't be allowed to plead the Fifth because he's already admitted to something illegal when he accepted the pardon. He could be in big trouble, and I imagine he is, if he has no pardon. On some occasions, when witnesses did invoke the Fifth, one of the prosecutors would play videos of speeches, TV interviews, or other testimonies the witnesses gave somewhere else. One juror adding, quote, I don't know if it was like cruelty, but they're like, if you're going to take the Fifth, we're going to watch you, end quote, said one juror. It's really interesting how some of these people, like Mark Meadows, wrote a book But yet, when he goes to testify, he takes the fifth. Like, he doesn't want to talk about what he wrote in his book. Interesting. Okay. The prosecutors, however, were passionate about saying that they needed the jurors to understand that just because someone invokes the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, it's not an admission of guilt. One juror talked of a notable moment when prosecutors were questioning a witness who obviously possessed additional evidence of election fraud in his or her office. Sorry, dog bark moment. One juror talked about a notable moment when prosecutors were questioning a witness who obviously possessed additional evidence of election fraud in his or her office. The juror said, quote, "I mentioned something like, 'Oh, I'd like to see that.' One of the DA team stood up, immediately left the room, came back in a few minutes later, and he handed a subpoena to the witness still sitting there," end quote. It was not disclosed who that was. Jurors said it took them 4 days to complete their final report, although they noted that it had been a work in progress. Prosecutors did provide a list of relevant laws, but jurors say they wrote the report themselves. One juror expressed appreciation, end quote, for the experience to look behind the scenes at Georgia politics and the ballot counting process. Another juror indicated that he'd grown more jaded after it became clear that some witnesses were telling the grand jury one thing under oath and then casting doubt on the system when they returned to the campaign trail, sometimes hours later. The juror added, quote, "I can honestly give a damn of whoever goes to jail, like personally. I care more about there being more respect for the system of the work that people do to make sure elections are free and fair." Another juror said, quote, "I tell my wife if every person in America knew every single word of information we knew, the country would not be divided as it is right now," quote. The juror also said why they understood why the public release of the full report needed to wait until DA Fani Willis makes her indictment decision. As you may recall, that decision was, quote, "eminent," end quote. Then it changed to legally eminent, which seems to be a different definition of eminent. And this was a great quote. One juror added, quote, "A lot's going to come out sooner or later, and it's going to be massive. It's going to be massive," end quote. Now, that's a statement right there. When the special grand jury wrapped up in mid-December, there was no celebration or fanfare with their 8-month saga. The jury simply went home. They were promised that they would get sent a pen and a coffee mug as a sign of appreciation for their service. Okay. Jurors said they've received neither so far. If you thought this was interesting, please like, subscribe, ring the bell, wherever it is. And if you got to this part of my video, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. You have my internal appreciation. Although I don't have any coffee mugs to send you. Thanks. Bye.